Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see so many people here. I'm Michelle Lowry, Director of Mentoring at Effect, and I want to welcome everybody to this Effect event, which is targeted at people at the mid-career level. I'm very excited about this event and personally very much looking forward to hearing the perspectives of everybody on the panel. A few administrative things real quick before we get started. First, a number of people expressed interest in the panel, but were unable to attend due to various conflicts. So for this reason, we're going to record the first portion of this session so that we can post it on Effect's website, and that video will be available for everybody to access. In the second portion of the session, we're going to open it up to Q&A, and we will not be recording this portion of the session. So in terms of if you have questions during the panel, you can go ahead and put any questions in the chat, but we're going to be answering and addressing those questions in the second portion of the panel. Second, after the event, we are going to do a follow-up, so please look for an email for us. Think throughout, what would you be interested in the future in terms of events like this or other related things. So that's it from me. I want to turn it over right away to our moderator so we can go ahead and get started. Our moderator is Jennifer Koski. She's the Kirby L. Kramer Endowed Chair in Finance at the University of Washington, and also the Associate Dean for Academic and Faculty Affairs. And I will let her introduce all of our panelists. Thank you, Jen.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. Good afternoon or good morning if you're on the West Coast like I am. We have some interesting topics to discuss today. Once you get tenure, your life as a faculty member can change substantially. If you're recently tenured, you may be recovering from the process of going through and getting ready for tenure. Your job description can change. Service can become a much bigger part of your responsibilities. And you're just trying to struggle to figure out what might be next. As time passes, you might get to the point where you're ready to take on more, perhaps a leadership role or some sort of important service role. How do you think about that? And how do you manage that transition? That's really what we're going to talk about today. How do you revisit and update your goals? How do you figure out what types of service activities, perhaps journal editorships, leadership roles, etc., to accept versus which ones to turn down? Once you figure out what you want, how do you make it happen? And the other side of this coin is if you have too much on your plate, how do you figure out how to say no and when to say no? So these are the topics we're going to talk about today. And to address these topics, I'm delighted to introduce our three very esteemed colleagues here. We have Elizabeth Otters-White. She is a coach and consultant with No Dramaturg Faculty Coaching and Consulting. And before that, she was a faculty member and academic leader at University of Wisconsin. We also have Manju Puri, who is a professor of finance at Duke. She has held numerous editorial roles in addition to policy and regulatory advisory positions and is currently an editor at RFS. And we also have Ingrid Werner, who is a professor of finance at Ohio State. Ingrid has also held numerous editorial roles in addition to some really interesting board positions, which I'll let her talk about more. So we're going to take about the first 30 minutes or so to talk about answer some pre-prepared questions, and then we're going to turn it over to the group, and we'd love to hear from you as well. Okay? So the first question, and I'm going to direct this one to Elizabeth, how should an associate professor, for example, think about leadership and service? How do you have any advice for sort of revisiting your long-term goals to clarify what really matters at this stage in your career?
Yeah. Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks everyone. It's great to see such a big group here. Yeah, and I really appreciate what you shared at the beginning, right? So tenure, everyone's experience is different. And yet I think it's universally exhausting and a very emotionally draining process. So depending on how long ago you got tenure and where you are, you may be having lots of different experiences right now in terms of your motivation and all of those things. So it can be a natural point to sort of stop and take stock and think about the future, frankly, maybe for the first time. I mean, I know for me as an assistant professor, it's kind of like tunnel vision and you're sort of doing what you think you're supposed to do, once you get tenure, it really is an opportunity to think about, what do you want to do? Hopefully you've all been thinking about that already for many years, but not all of us do, right? So in terms of thinking about leadership and service, there's so many ways and so many forms that those things can take. I think you really do want your own interests and kind of what excites you to drive that. So I'll just throw out a couple of thoughts about how you might start to, as Jennifer asked, kind of get a sense of your goals, or look to the longer term. And then I'll also put a couple of links in the chat to some of the things that I mentioned. So I think that figuring out what's really important to you is kind of key to all of this, right? So you have some newfound flexibility, and you're also going to have a lot of demands, or at least a lot of opportunities, right? So figuring out what are your core values that are sort of driving you, thinking about, maybe even what you want your legacy to be, right? Or how do you enjoy spending your time? What does an ideal day look like, right? So there are lots of different kinds of exercises we can think about, even like a personal vision or mission or purpose statement can be helpful sort of touchstones or guideposts as we're making these decisions, and remembering that you are in charge and you've got lots of flexibility. So I don't want to take any more time than that, because I know we have a lot to share. So I'll put a couple links in the chat, and then if people have specific questions, I'm happy to share more later in the program.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. So transitioning into talk more specifically about types of service, I think there's three main categories I think of. Professional service, this is to the AFA, to the editorial roles, that type of thing. We have external service. This might be consulting. This might be a board of directors type role. And then lastly, we have what I'll call internal service. This is a committee within your department, or department chair, or a school or university committee. So we're going to touch briefly on each of those. And Manju, I'd like to turn to you now. What are some pros and cons of professional service, and the parallel, if you're interested, how do you make it happen?
Right. And so I think it is a very important question. You've worked so hard to get tenure. Now what do you want to do? And there are many ways that you can look at it. And I just want to talk about a couple of other ways maybe of looking at it, and then I'll turn to the specific question. That is, when we think of service at the school level, I think is a very natural thing to think of, and almost surely you're going to get tapped very, very heavily there. Another aspect of service that you might think about in terms of how do you want an impact is just outside the school and nationally, like what are the areas that might be close to your interest? Like for me, regulation is very close to what I do. And so it was quite natural for me to, I was at the FDIC, and I think that helps broaden your horizons, creates maybe a different kind of impact. And another aspect, right, is globally, because so many academicians are foreign born, right? And so the opportunity to be able to actually do something in your country, mentor with and I've again done that, whether it's with the central bank or with schools there. I think these are all things to think about. But importantly, as Elizabeth said, it needs to be consistent with what sort of works for you. Now, what are the pros and cons of service? The con is easy. It just takes enormous amount of time, right? And it's like everyone wants a piece of you, right? You're a woman, you're going to get asked to be on every single committee, and you'll be asked to do a lot. Now, what are the pros? I mean, the pros are service can sort of broaden your horizons, right? And so if we think in terms of editorships, for example, right, it's certainly, you have a chance to make an impact. You can do right by deserving papers. And so there's a lot that you can sort of do there. And so part of it is what do you want to do, and then part of it is what is the process to get there, right? And so if you decide that I would like to do more editorial service, for example, how would you sort of go about it? right? And so, you know, I think first, being an expert in your area means you're going to get called on to be a referee in that area. And if you're going to be a referee, if you do a conscientious job, you'll sort of get noticed, you'll get more and more papers, probably more difficult papers, and then eventually you'll become an associate editor. And maybe initially it's at specialized journals, but that's typically the path of editorial service. And from there, you might move to being associate editor at one of the more general finance journals. And you know, so more involvement and service in whatever your mission is or whatever appeals to you will sort of move you along that path.
Great, thank you. I wanted to touch on next the area of external service, for example, serving as boards. And so Ingrid, I'll address that one to you. And if you also have any general comments just about service overall, that would be great as well. So.
Sure, and thank you for inviting me to participate in the panel, and I'm looking forward to interacting with the rest of the audience later. But I've had the good fortune of being asked to do a lot of things, like many of us here, and I've actually always seen it as an opportunity. But of course, it comes at a cost, as Elizabeth pointed out, and Manju as well. We're super busy, so you have to figure out what's right for you and what you enjoy doing. That's really important. For me, I'm going to focus first on talking a bit about the orthogonal things to our, it's not really orthogonal, but sort of the really outside type of activities, which is board memberships, and also an activity which many of our male colleagues are engaged in, which is economic litigation consulting. But I also am happy to talk later about the professional service and community government service that Manju touched on. So I currently serve on 2 boards, and I have not been engaged in litigation consulting, but I know a bit about the field, so I will preface it with that. So why would you possibly do that when you're already super busy and stressed out and trying to figure out how to do fewer things as opposed to more things? What I have found is I've learned a tremendous amount from the outside activities that I am engaged in. And they've both been useful for research and for teaching. So it certainly helps in many dimensions of our academic job. The other thing that it brings opportunities to do is to grow your external networks. And this is important in many ways. You can bring in people to class, you can learn what's going on in industry instead of just reading about it in the Wall Street Journal after the fact, and so forth. But it also is a way to participate in academic networks that women, by and large, have been excluded from, which, it's too bad, which has to do with, preponderance of white males on boards and also white males in economic and litigation consulting. So I find it very rewarding. It's flexible. You can say no when you don't want to do it. Board work takes time, but it's very focused on board meetings. And, you know ahead of time, you set a schedule, you can kind of carve out the time it takes. And finally, on the why side, I would say, we never know where we will end up in life and what actually suits us best. And we can see Elizabeth decided, she had a fantastic academic career, but decided her passion was really in leadership and consulting, helping other people succeed. And we never know. So having exposure to a lot of different activities is helpful, also thinking about the future. Having said that, how do you do it? Well, I'm really not a good example because when it comes to my own activities, they're kind of just fallen in my lap. I have done nothing other than to participate generally in academia and trying to be open-minded, talking to people and networking. But I do think that there's some ways, if you, for example, are interested in pursuing opportunities to be engaged in boards. There are organizations called Board Prospects, Board Member Connect. There's online networks that are around board membership. Even just the keywords on your LinkedIn page may be helpful. The other way of getting attention for potential board positions is really to serve on nonprofit boards or in your local community, being active there. So that would be tips on kind of how at least to get engaged in that. When it comes to the litigation consulting, I would say there are plenty of sponsors of our events that are firms that are super happy to have women work with them. Like we have Cornerstone, who's been very helpful to Affect, but also Analysis Group, Brattle Group, Charles River Associate, Compass, and Navigant. And these firms are staffed with PhD economists and statisticians that actually do a lot of the grunt work when it comes to supporting an expert. So with that said, I don't want to delve too long into this. I know that we have lots of questions ahead of us. So Jennifer, take it back.
Great, thank you. I'll just add, I think some of the larger business schools have executive programs on how to be a board member as well. I think both Harvard and Stanford have those that you can attend. I think they're rather expensive, but that's another way to network into the board community. The next question I wanted to talk about, which is, I think, came up earlier as sort of inevitable, which is the internal service. Chances are, you know, once you become an associate professor, all of a sudden everyone pounces and they start asking you to be on committees. At some point, you may face an opportunity to be a department chair. I see some relatively new department chairs in the group here, or associate dean, or leader of a faculty council, something like that. Elizabeth, let me come back to you. Given your broader experience as a consultant, do you have any general thoughts about that stage? How do you assess it? How do you figure out what to accept?
Yeah. Well, I think again, many of us, I think, know, you know, we have sort of an inkling, is this of interest or not? And so I certainly would not pursue it if it's not something that you at least have a little fire in you, like, you know, I'm curious. Because these are, as you know, they're very demanding, as you know very well, Jennifer. Hopefully we'll hear from you on this topic as well. Very demanding roles. I will say just a couple of quick things to think about. So I don't know what it's like in everyone else's department, but there certainly is this sort of like dark side, you know, leadership is the dark side. I think that's a pretty common sort of narrative. That was not my experience at all in terms of my own personal / professional experience of being a leader. I found it immensely rewarding. I actually loved it. I felt like I was able to use parts of myself, some of my skills that I wasn't really actively using just as a faculty member. That said, for me, it was sort of all consuming and felt unsustainable, which is one of the reasons I'm now doing what I'm doing, because I learned a lot about how to make it more sustainable. If I'd stayed, I'd probably be better now, right? But so I'm also trying to help others manage that. I will say that dark side narrative, though, there's a reality there, right? So to the extent that people sort of believe that, your relationships do shift, right? When you assume a leadership role, even though we know in reality there really is no power differential, right? Just the way academia is, there's still sort of a perception of being different. And I did experience that. And I did have to sort of navigate the shifting of important relationships. So that's one thing that I would say to be aware of. I would not shy away from it if you think you're potentially interested, especially if it's in an area that kind of lights you up. As I said, in my experience, it was really rewarding. I really enjoyed it.
Manju and Ingrid, do you have anything you'd like to add on this question? And I'm going to jump in too, but yeah.
Yeah, sure. I think, you know, once you become senior, you are asked to do more and more service. And so it is useful to ask, what is the kind of service I want to do? And things that are of interest to you, like let's say there's a program, or there's a center where the research is close to your area, and it's an opportunity to pull in like-minded researchers, or start an interdisciplinary seminar schedule that will, that will actually make you feel happy, right? And so, so doing service not as, oh my God, this is something I've got to do, but trying to pick those parts that appeal to you, I think is really important.
Yeah, I totally agree. And this is obviously important. But I also think that, you can be a bit strategic as well, because you're going to get lots of requests going forward. And you probably already are experiencing this. So being strategic by picking early the ones that you want to work on allows you to say, yeah, I'd love to do that, but I've already done this, this, and this. So I'll have to finish these projects and then I can go on to the next thing. So it allows you to say no, not to say no in a way that's not offensive, in the sense that you're showing that you're actually doing a lot of service already. So yeah. Jennifer, I give it back to you. I know you have lots of experience.
I know, I just have a couple of things I wanted to add. I mean, the first is that there is kind of an inherent tension, because as a woman or as a member of any other underrepresented group, you're likely to be asked to take on disproportionately much service. And this tension is that schools and organizations really do value having a diversity of opinions, and you want to have all points of view represented. But it's especially challenging to get there if some groups are underrepresented, right? And the very process of acting them to engage in this capacity can have negative consequences for their ability to be productive. So I'm very aware of that in my role now, because I'm often the one out asking people to do service. And it's a trade-off. So be very deliberate. One of the reasons I became very interested in what I'm calling mid-career mentoring is because I was asked to become associate dean. And I had not been a department chair before. So this was 3 years ago. This was right in the early stages of the pandemic. I had no idea, should I do this? Should I not? What does it mean? And the pandemic, of course, made everything crazy. And I realized we don't spend a lot of time helping people with that stage of decisions. Lots of resources motivated towards helping new assistant professors, and your goal is clear, publish, right? But these other questions are much more challenging. So I guess the other thing I would like to add now is, if you're asked to do something significant, like be a department chair or take on a major program, every single one of the colleagues on the panel have mentioned how important it is to think about your own values and what's important. I'd also strongly recommend you don't say yes right away, but you say, I'd like to think about it. And then go talk to people, right? Find a trusted mentor, find a senior colleague, find someone else in your department who has done it. And this will really help you understand what it is. And that is the main way you can take time and be thoughtful and decide to dedicate your time, your very valuable time, in ways that you'll be able to be the most productive. So that's just my general thoughts on this question. But I want to go a little further, and Ingrid, I think you mentioned this one. We've been talking so far as if there's all these wonderful opportunities out there and we all want to take on more. There are, I have discovered, only 24 hours in a day, and we can't. Okay, so you have your plan, you have your priorities, you're still going to be asked to do other things. How do you decide when you should turn down something? There's this balance between being a good citizen and also trying to maintain your research career. How do you say no? I mean, Ingrid, you started on this, I think, when you mentioned that if you do take on something that is your passion, you can have some control. Does anyone on the panel, I think, have any other thoughts about saying no? It is okay, by the way, to say no. That's my main message today.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to reemphasize that obviously it's okay to say no. And there is often the feeling, I think, in the face when you just become tenured, where you think, oh, this is a unique opportunity. I'll never get that chance again. No, that's not right. There's going to be lots of opportunities. So if the timing isn't right, don't say yes just because you think it's the last chance you will get. But I also want to echo what Jennifer said. And this applies both to internal service to the university and also externally. Ask your more senior colleagues, discuss it with other women in the profession to think through, is this really the right thing for me right now? So asking for more time to think about it is really, really key.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, and that is, sometimes the requests all come at once, and people don't even know so many requests are being made of you, right? So your department asks you something, the dean asks you something, the university asks you something, the editors ask for something, there's a national organization that asks for something, and suddenly you have all of these requests, and each one is, well, I just asked you to do this one thing, and why won't you do it for me? So the number of times, I've got that, I invited you for a conference and you didn't come, and it's like, well, I already had a commitment on that day. And I think, if it's all sort of service related, so part of what is useful is giving perspective to your department chair or dean on the many ways that you are being called. And if you're being asked to serve in multiple capacities, you can say, look, I'm very happy to serve, but where is my service of the most value, right? And so if it's something generic like a curriculum review, obviously it's very important, but presumably anyone can do it. But for me, if it's like, oh, we need something on fintech for our alumni, then sure, how many people can they call on? So then that would be me, right? And so normally that's what I'll ask. I said, can you, I'm happy to serve, but if you can see where it really is important that it specifically be me, just because I'm getting all these multiple requests. And so then I trade off sort of one request against another, simply because, when they look at it, they say, yeah, you can't do all of that. And I said, yeah, so let's just do what's important. You tell me what's important for you. Right. And normally that will be a match between your strengths and what your school wants. And so if you do it in a dialogue and a cooperative way, I think then people take it in the right spirit. At least I hope they do.
I think these are all such great points. I'll just build on a little bit on what's been said. So to echo Jennifer, I think absolutely we never need to respond right away. Just take a little bit of time, especially when it's a yes, no, like you're committing to something. Do not say yes right away. In fact, I would encourage you to make no the default. So if you're going to answer right away, the answer is no. You don't tell people that necessarily, but that's the way you operate, right? And then you have to convince yourself that it's a yes. And if you can't convince yourself easily, then the no stands, right? As opposed to, because so often we try to, oh, but how can I say no? And I really should. No is the start. Then try to get yourself to a yes, right? And then the part about how do you actually say no, right? Once you've decided, I think having canned responses, it can be really helpful. 2 or 3 different versions that you literally just have, like that you can cut and paste into an email, or that you have in your head and you can say. Of course, if it's in person, you can simply say, I need to think about it, if it's not an immediate no, right? But sometimes coupling a yes with a no can also help us feel a little bit better, right? So as Manju was saying, maybe there's something about it that really appeals to you, right? There's an aspect that really is suited to you. And then there's a whole other part of it that anybody could do, right? So maybe you can change the scope, right? And you can focus on one part, or maybe you can suggest someone else who would sincerely appreciate that opportunity, whatever. I think we often have a lot more flexibility and a lot more control than we think we do. We put all these expectations on ourselves that we think are coming from other people. We think people expect us to do this, that, or the other. Very often, those people are not, in fact, thinking about us at all, or very little, right? And so to just remember we have choices and we can craft things much closer to what we want than we might think initially.
I would add, again, it is okay to say no. Okay. And it's okay. My default is to think that's selfish to say no, right? To try to protect my time, but be selfish, right? Take care of yourself. Be your own biggest advocate. I have a colleague in the management department, and she actually teaches this in the MBA curriculum. So we teach our MBAs how to say no. When to say no, questions you can ask yourself are things like, will I feel upset with myself or someone else if I say yes? What can I gain if I say no versus yes? If I say yes to this, what am I saying no to? Is this urgent or can it wait? I think somebody said earlier, you're going to get asked again. Can someone else besides me do it? We tend to think we're indispensable, but we're not. And do I have time? And then when you're ready to say no, I think my colleagues here have brought up several important tips. Ask for help prioritizing, right? Well, I'm already doing these 3 things. If I take on this, what should I give up? Be straightforward and simple and practice, right? Just come up with some different ways you can think about it. So those are some general hints on that, okay? I think that's the end of our pre-prepared questions. So we wanted to save the second half of this section for questions from the audience. I think we're going to take a moment here and turn off the recording.